So as I go through my presentation, I want to point something out and kind of dispel a myth, and I'll revisit this. When you think of lumber and timber, lumberjacks, and certainly NAU's own mascot is this very burly white gentleman. Nothing wrong with that. But one needs to think about what that does in terms of really, in actuality, there was a major African American presence in the lumber industry here in northern Arizona. And inadvertently, in some ways, Jack, the lumberjack, kind of erases that history. Something to think about. How much does he really represent the history of this region? So when you want to talk about African Americans, especially African Americans in the Southwest, really Africans came here with the Spanish. Most people think of Africans coming to this continent as being part of the 1619 project, which is absolutely true. Those are some of the first slaves who were brought to North America, certainly on the East Coast, in Virginia. But in actuality, when Columbus landed on this continent, Africa came with him. Africa, Moors, had moved out of northern Africa into southern Europe. For those of you who know or remember your European history, around AD 400, there had been this long history of trade and exchange, cultural exchange between northern Africa, western Africa, and eastern Africa, and southern Europe. So by the time Spain landed here, there were Africans on that ship. African influence had already been a part of European culture for a millennia. So really, the first influence of Africa and Africans came with the Spanish. And then, of course, later was with the slaves who were brought in by the Dutch. But early on, these were not only enslaved, but also free people of color who were coming in with the Spanish. Esteban is probably the most known to be in this area in the Southwest. He was, in fact, a slave who ended up in Florida, was on a boat. They ended up in Florida for about 7 years, made their way to central Mexico, and then he was used as kind of an advanced guard to look for the Cibola, city of gold. And he was actually apparently killed somewhere near the Pueblo Zuni, but he was not the only one. He's just the one we know. So he was one of many who probably came or were part of the Spanish. And then, of course, Pio Pico, if you grew up in LA, you certainly know about Pio Pico. Everything in their mother is called Pico. And he actually was of African descent and had actually been the governor of California, before it was California, twice. We have yet to have a black governor in California. This man was a governor twice. So really, there has been an influence of African influence in the Southwest, more so than people realize. So as Arizona and New Mexico starts to open up and actually becomes these territories, early Africans or people of African descent are making their way out to the West. They're even being brought here. They're used as part of the military in the Mexican-American War, usually as servants for the military generals, etc. When gold is found in California, California is not a state. Southerners do not travel without their slaves. So you had slaves who were with Southerners who were making their way to California to take advantage of the gold. So California came into the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state. But prior to it coming into the Union, there were slaves here. There were slaves here in Arizona. There were slaves in New Mexico. We were not states. We were territories. There was no control over that. So as the West opens up, so hopefully you all know where the Beale Wagon Road is. We're very close to the Beale Wagon Road. And 1857, this is pre-Civil War. So this was one of the major military roads to California, especially to the gold mines. There were definitely Africans and people of African descent and enslaved and free who were making their way on this route to California. So just examples of people of African descent who would have been in the Southwest. James Beckworth, the center there, he was a mountain man. There were quite a few mountain men. He's the most well known, mainly because people may be familiar with Beckworth Pass in the Sierra Nevadas. It's absolutely named for him. I think he had married with the Crow. And apparently African, especially the fur trading business, someone were thought to be really good with languages and able to pick up the tribal languages. I don't know if that's true, but thought and true are two separate things. But he was not the only one, but he's the most well known. Interestingly enough, people may or may not be aware of the fact that a lot of Mormons were Southerners. The Mormon Church had actually actively brought in Southerners into the church. They brought with them their slaves. So when Mormons were making their way out of Nauvoo to Salt Lake City, what became Salt Lake City, some of them were bringing slaves, and there were enslaved people who came with them. So Utah actually had enslaved people. Biddy Mason there on the left, she was an enslaved woman whose owner was a Mormon who took her to California. At this point, California is a state and a free state. She recognized, he had a ranch in San Bernardino, California. She and a couple other slaves were told that they actually, technically it was illegal for them to be in California, and they sued for their freedom and won it. So she actually was a midwife. She purchased land in downtown Los Angeles, became very wealthy. She helped fund the first AME church in Los Angeles, which still exists. She sponsored a lot of African Americans who were coming to California and helped them get established. And there's a park and things. So, they certainly were a part of the West and certainly left their mark here. So specifically to Arizona, I want to point out the 1860 specific amount, 21, notice it's all free. So this is pre-emancipation. Also remember I said we had a lot of people who were Spanish, Hispanic, and African descent. They are clearly not being counted here, and most likely only free black people are being counted here. That's why I say point free. So one thing, when America takes over the Southwest, these people of African descent who happen to be Spanish or Mexican, that gets glossed over. That is not counted here. So a lot of those folks lose that identity as America takes over the West. And then if you notice, there's certainly a big, huge jump right about 1890, and there's a reason for that, and that is the presence of the U.S. colored troops, AKA the Buffalo Soldiers. They were first, and most people know of them as being down on the border, and absolutely, Fort Huachuca, that whole area, that's what most people know of them and their presence, because they were very active along the border. They essentially were the first border patrol. However, they actually were first stationed in Verde Valley and Prescott at Fort Whipple in the 1880s. They literally made up 1/5 of the U.S. West military right after the Civil War. So they were stationed throughout the Southwest, including California and every state in the Union. They were stationed at one time or another, and absolutely were used primarily to help push tribal communities onto reservations, but they also were part of the railroad surveys. They made sure that people who traveled on the various different immigrant roads did so safely. So they were essentially big-time police in a way, and had a major presence out here in the Southwest. So you can't talk about African Americans out West unless you really talk about what this means and how it contrasts from the Southeast, especially after the Civil War. After the Civil War, even though with emancipation and certainly reclamation, there was a push through implementing variety of social and actual laws and other codes to basically keep African Americans not necessarily enslaved, but certainly in their place, so to speak. And this was very much prevalent. Obviously, in the Southeast, I don't have to explain that here. Out West, when African Americans make their way out West, there is segregation here, and there is racism here, but nowhere there, you don't see it codified as much in laws out here in the states out West as you do in the South. So although there are restrictions, and I'll talk a little bit how that really manifests itself in the timber industry, there are restrictions here. Still, for African Americans coming out west, there's still a lot more freedom than there would have been in the Southeast. There's not as much racial violence and other aspects. Is there segregation? Yeah, absolutely. But there's still a little more opportunity for African Americans who make their way out west than there are in many ways in the Southeast. So this is part of the impetus for people moving out of the Southeast to come west, to look for a little more opportunity. Okay, so let's talk about Arizona's census, and this is where we're going to get really talking about the timber industry in particular. So as you can see, Arizona becomes a state, and certainly after World War II, you see a major jump in African American population. And I'm going to tell you exactly why that is. So before we get really talking about the timber industry here, you really have to look at the timber industry nationally and the history of it. Timber, especially when America was growing, first starting and growing, the biggest timber stocks available were certainly in the Northeast, Vermont, New Hampshire, Boston, those areas. That became the center of the timber industry. Slavery was legal in the northern states until roughly 1804. So really, as slavery is abolished in the northern states, you start seeing other people come in, Irish and others who become laborers in the timber industry in the Northeast. However, and there's a major development, and certainly as the American Industrial Revolution starts, you start seeing this huge demand for timber. Also, railroads are beginning to come in at this time. You also start seeing this major demand for timber. So the timber reserves of the Northeast are certainly being heavily taxed. I was in Ohio last summer, West Virginia, Monongahela, and looking at what it was, the forest in, say, 1900, and certainly by 1930, when the Forest Service started purchasing those lands, it was absolutely denuded. Of course, that's in the South, but you really see industry help to really major impact on the forest reserves up in the Northeast. So what happens is the Civil War, of course, another tax on the timber. You need to build those things to go towards the war. Post-Civil War, that opens up a economically devastated South and another source of timber in the South. It had not, the Southern, prior to the Civil War, Southerners were focused in on agriculture, cotton, corn, those things, not necessarily their timber. They were using it to go after turpentine and other types of products, but not the wood reserves, not in the intensity that was happening in the North. After the Civil War, you see this development. You see Northerners coming down to the South and starting to purchase these lands and put up the mills and intensively go after this lumber. So they start putting up sawmills in record number and very large industrial-sized sawmills. So starting around the 1880s, certainly well after the Civil War, and right into the 1920s. And your typical sawmill, huge, intensive, obviously needing a lot to feed it. What's interesting, of course, is who's your biggest resource for labor after the Civil War. So this is what happens is you bring in your biggest source of labor, African Americans, who at this point probably already have knowledge about timber. They probably were the ones going out and harvesting it down in the South. So when the lumber industry really kicks in the South, African Americans are an absolutely major part of the labor force for the Southern timber industry. Now, we're in the South, so we know that there's major amounts of segregation. These are company towns. People are living in the same communities, likely in segregated sections. And they have what is known, what I call the labor caste system, where you're okay as an African American to work at this level, but you're not going to make it up to management. And only certain people are going to make it up into higher management. So they hire large quantities, but you were only capped your career movement was only at a certain level, and especially here in the South. But they had a real need, and they were hiring people. And these jobs were good for the South for the most part. So I love this number. So by 1927, more than 200,000 Southern men considered lumber manufacture their primary occupation, 2/3 of which were black. 2/3. So that's a huge number. For the most part, these are towns pretty much run by the lumber industry in the South. So this is a good example. They have neighborhoods. They would set up neighborhoods. They would have the black neighborhood versus, probably Irish neighborhood versus. They had their own separate community centers, their own separate churches, and et cetera. So the codes were very well enforced. But they certainly mingled together at work and were in the same community. So here in Arizona, we see the opening of the West even more, especially when the Atchison Topeka comes into our area, originally the Atlantic and Pacific, which later purchased by the Atchison Topeka, opens up our own forests for demand. Actually, and you see companies come in to take advantage of this. There are certainly a lot of companies that come into Arizona. Saginaw Manistee, interestingly enough, is actually in Williams, but does move to Flagstaff in the 1950s. But what's clear about Saginaw Manistee is that it basically built Williams, and they stated as such in the newspaper. Even though there were African Americans in Williams, living in Williams and working in Williams and are part of the community, Saginaw Manistee actively did not hire black people. They are out of the Midwest. They were not used to being in a community where they had black labor, and they, for whatever reason, didn't feel that they should hire black people. They hired a lot of Hispanics, and they hired tribal people. The railroad hired a lot of Hispanics and tribal people. But for whatever reason, they, at least according to the newspaper and some of their management, they actively did not hire African Americans. So some of the companies did, some of the companies did not. There were black people here who were, in fact, who were here in Flagstaff as part of this community. And in this case, this is great, right up the street here in Fort Valley. This is an African American. They were experimenting on different products out of the forest, and this being turpentine. As I mentioned, turpentine actually was a big product in the South, and African Americans were used to actually collect it. I don't think that this became very popular, but they certainly were experimenting with it. And who do you have locally who might happen to know how to actually get this thing out of the tree? Well, somebody who's done it someplace else. It's a sap in the cambium of the tree, and they're collecting it there. Notice that this is the experimental forest, so they're trying all sorts of things. But that's literally right up the street from here. So, 1920s, the timber industry in the South just starts to die. They've absolutely overextended themselves, took out way too much timber, and you have this glut of this population who are highly skilled. So what do? What I love about this is notice, it talks about the migration. When most people talk about African American migration, they're usually talking about going out of rural, going north to the car industry, to all the manufacturing industry. So they're going from ag to the manufacturers. What's happened, what's unique about the timber industry is these are highly skilled timber people coming out of the South timber, taking their skills into another timber area. So you're going from rural to rural rather than rural than industrial. So that's what makes this really unique. But I love this because notice, where is the arrow pointing? It's pointing to Phoenix. And notice they're also the major centers, and actually there's some truth to that, because Phoenix became the center of the cotton industry, and they were actively hiring African Americans out of the South to come pick cotton. So that absolutely was happening a little later, but in actuality, the timber industry was a major driver for bringing people out of the South to Arizona. So specifically for our area, this was one of the major companies that did it. They were the first. The Katy Lumber Company literally packed up, they closed their doors, they packed up everything. They took something like 500 of their employees, many of which were black, put them on a railroad car. They had purchased an existing mill on the White Mountain Apache Reservation. They showed up, dusted everything off, and literally within 2 days of showing up, they were back at it again, now in the White Mountains. They brought with them their black employees. They also brought with them the social mores of the South. They have a black community, they're separate from the white community, but who have their separate schools, their separate church. But what this does do is it opens up a whole new industry for black people who are trying to figure out how to survive in a struggling and dying industry in the South. So what happens? The migrant story. You come up north, you go home for Christmas to go see family. You tell them about all your opportunities. Oh, and by the way, there's this stuff called snow that you're not used to from Louisiana. So I think it was a combination of word of mouth, but also advertisement. I think they did advertise. I noticed places like Nevada, for instance, the mining industry would advertise in the South to try and get black people out here because they knew that this was labor that they could have readily available in areas where there wasn't a lot of labor. So, but also you hear about it, you tell your friends, you know friends, and so on and so on. So basically it triggers this diaspora, in a sense, of people out of the southern timber industry into Arizona. So why are people coming? We already kind of touched on this, but part of this has to do with the social aspect of being in the South. The truth of the matter is racial violence was a big part of their lives. Those who were probably living in timber towns were probably not as subject to as much of the racial violence as they would have in other agricultural communities, but they were certainly aware of it. And so one of the things about leaving that South and coming up here is that you were less likely to be subject to this kind of violence. The other thing, too, is apparently they made more money here. So my understanding is, and that's because of the unions, not because the companies here are being magnanimous. My understanding is what they made in a week in Louisiana, they made in a day here in northern Arizona. That's impetus to move. The other thing that a lot of people didn't know, and I certainly didn't until I got into this, is in fact this is a really transitory field. So they're not only making their way to Arizona, they're making their way to the entire Western timber industry. So in actuality, Katy leaves in 1922-24, where the Hutchinson Lumber Company actually leaves in 1920. There is a Black History Society in Oroville, California, I just recently found out, which is where the Hutchinson Company was. And then the Powell Company outside of Reno, 1926. So Katy is one of many southern lumber companies that are leaving the South, coming to the West, and they're bringing their skilled workers with them. Oregon, interestingly enough, Oregon as well. So what is it like for these folks who are making this trip? Well, for one thing, this is before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So people could choose who they served and who they did not serve. So for African Americans making their way and hitting the road, well, you know, there were some things that certainly had to be navigated. And one of is, you know, where do you actually get gas? Luckily, the railroad, once you left the South, the railroads were no longer segregated. And once you also came west of the Mississippi, you could actually stop at a Fred Harvey house. Fred Harvey did not discriminate. So the Harvey houses actually not only hired black people, they served them. So when you came out Route 66, you could stop in Winslow at the La Posada and actually get fed. So sunset towns, for those who are not familiar, these are communities that had actual ordinances which would not allow black people to be within their boundaries after dark. So these are things that certainly hampered people who decided that they were going to drive out of the South to the West. And by this point, people do have the funds to purchase a car and make that drive. But it certainly is not without its challenges. So the other thing about migrating out of the South to the West is you have a whole different code. They know that there's segregation here, but at least in the South, you know there's segregation, you know there's racial violence, but you also know the system. You know how to play the system, you know what the system's about. When you come west, it's a different type of segregation. There's a different type of system. So that's one of the challenges. Luckily, most folks have family and friends. Certainly when you make your way out here, it's helpful to know at least one or two people who are out here already that can help you adjust and find you a place to live. And one of the other things, I have a shameless plug here, the Green Book absolutely was available certainly by the 40s, if not earlier. The Green Book and other guides like it were critical for people making their way out west to help them to be able to navigate and know where they could get services. And I absolutely strongly recommend, if you get a chance, to take a look at this. This is a great online survey showing of all the properties that actually participated in the Green Book right here in Flagstaff along Route 66. And as I already stated, community was absolutely important. Here in Flagstaff itself, I'm sure most of you are aware that the area south in what's called the South Side was primarily the center of the Black community. You come in on the railroad and you basically turn south and you hit the Black community. There was a Elks Club, there was a school, there were other social organizations that were there to help Black people as they came in, help people get jobs, help them find homes, in some cases build their own homes. So it was quite a community here in Flagstaff. But here's the thing, it's not only here in Flagstaff, but you also see you have Black people coming here to Flagstaff, to Williams, to Winslow, to Holbrook as well. So Flagstaff's a good example, but all of these communities who participate in the lumber industry also have Black communities in them, and still do to this day. So just an example, so yeah, arriving at Flagstaff, as I said, you get off the train, you turn south, you certainly most likely have somebody you know already here who can help you get associated. So men were hired at the mills. Women usually worked as domestics or in hotels or restaurants north of the tracks. They could not stay there or live there. They lived in the south part, but that's certainly a place that women would have gotten employment. Also, the school system in Arizona from 1909 to 1954 was segregated. Flagstaff had a large enough population of African Americans that they actually had 2 schools for Black students. In Williams, where I live, there were a few Black students. I read something where they literally, like some inspector came by, they put up a blanket that separated the 2 kids in the classroom, and then when the inspector left, they dropped the blanket, you know. Because by law, they had to keep them separated. But for the most part, not so much. In Williams especially, the biggest population was Hispanic, and Hispanic kids were in fact segregated and taught in separate classrooms in the basement of the school. So, so for communities that had the population, you had separate schools. For communities that didn't, they just figured out separating by rooms or other ways. So really, you see African Americans are coming up and really are participating in just about every aspect of the timber industry here in northern Arizona. Oftentimes on the lower level, but having come here, some of them were able to make more career movement, more so than they probably would have if they remained in the South. And we're a major part of this industry right up until the industry dies, right about 1985. I happened to be speaking to some community members in Winslow, and Black community members, and they were kind of mentioning how back in the 70s and 80s there were Black people everywhere. But what happens is when the timber industry dies in the 80s, people needed to find work. So you see a lot of folks leave the community. They go to Tucson, they go to Phoenix, they go places where the work is available. Plus you have the generational aspect. Young people don't want to stay in small towns. So they move on to other careers and other opportunities. However, there are still aspects of this community still here. I know in Winslow, Holbrook, and Flagstaff and Williams, for instance, all have active black churches, black Baptist churches. The Galilee Church in Williams was established in 1959, and some of the folks who came when they inaugurated the church, several of the folks who came were out of the church in Holbrook, hopped on the train, came out and celebrated. They were members of the church in Holbrook. The Baptist church here in Flagstaff is still in existence. So in Winslow, for instance, there's still several black families who live there, who've been there for multiple generations, are still a big part of the community, and have, and although you probably wouldn't know it if you walk through Holbrook or Winslow today, they are still very much, and that's the same with Williams. It's a small community, but if you know where to look, you can actually see it. But it is a small community, but they're still there. So as I said, the legacy is here if you know where to look. I don't need to tell you all about Coral Evans, but the nice thing about Coral Evans is, for those who don't know, she actually works for Senator Kelly now. She is, I believe, third generation Flagstaff. Her family came here, purchased land, built a home, which she still lives in, down on the south side. The Murdoch Center is the remains of there were two schools for black children here, one of which was on basically essentially what is now the NAU campus. That building that is the Murdoch Center is a portion of it actually, so for the original school. Apparently it burned down and they rebuilt it. So, but it is in the location and is still very much an active part of the South Side community. Some of you may or may not know the Carolina Chocolate Drops. Don Flemons was a founding member of that wonderful band. If you don't, please check them out. You may be familiar with Rhianna Gibbons, who was also a member. His father was a minister here in Flagstaff. Some of you may even have known him. And I think he's down in Phoenix now. But so he put out an album recently, Black Cowboys, and that's part of his experience, his life experience, and highlighting the music around that. And then, of course, the South Oroville African American Historical Society. Now, I'm trying to reach out and learn more about them, but there absolutely is a community, and I suspect there are other pockets of black communities in the Sierra Nevadas and other places associated with the lumber industry there that has just simply their history has not been explored. So let's take a look at this. When you look at these images, does it give you a different perspective? Now that you realize how prevalent African Americans were in the lumber industry here. Kind of makes you rethink about why, when you look at Mr. Jack, Lumberjack, you realize inadvertently, it's certainly a great symbol, but inadvertently it's kind of hiding and glossing over this African American history. Not intentional, but it does. It doesn't help to represent what really happened here in this history. So there's a movement afoot to try and address that, but we won't go into it. Another shameless plug real quickly, the Buffalo Soldiers. There is quite a bit of history still in Arizona around the Buffalo Soldiers. Fort Huachuca, certainly, and if you haven't had a chance to get down to Fort Huachuca, there's a great museum there. You can get on base to go see. Also, Fort Verde, Camp Verde, and Verde has a whole display. They have a thing every February. They have Buffalo Soldier reenactors. Fort Whipple has stuff around that. Also, Camp Naco just was south of Bisbee. It has now got a huge grant through the Mellon Foundation. It actually has standing buildings. It was occupied between 1910 and 1913, and then later was a CCC camp. And they are right now on the precipice of actually refurbishing the buildings that are still standing and doing a lot of work in that. So if you have an interest in Buffalo Soldier history, keep an eye on that. There's a great story map available online that just came on board, and they're doing a lot around this. So there's a big movement in the state as a whole to really start to highlight our Buffalo Soldier history. So if you have an interest, please keep an eye on that. Well, because you realize the Buffalo Soldiers were used to go after Pancho Villa. So when Pancho Villa was doing his insurrection thing down in northern Mexico, the Buffalo Soldiers were one of the key military that was sent down on the border to protect the U.S. Because they literally did do things like, they actually lobbed bombs at Naco on the border, and they had cross-border fights and did a lot of things on the border during Pancho Villa's time period. So the Buffalo Soldiers, that's why they're most known to associated with the border, even though they were actually stationed much more northern. But and that's, the good reason why they had such a presence. So that would have been a temporary military camp. Yeah, so Naco is the one on the left-hand side. So it was built with, it was very well established. And it has about 4 or 5 adobe buildings that are still standing, that were part of a hospital and bunk area. They had stables, they had other things there. So it was more established, but they had the military had a lot of temporary camps along the border, especially during Pancho Villa days. So thank you very much.